Muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Bienvenidos y muchas gracias por estar con nosotros esta tarde para esta primera sesión de los Diálogos Porteños 2024, organizados en conjunto por la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Valparaíso y la Universidad Católica del Norte. El objetivo de este ciclo de 4 conferencias al año consiste en explorar una temática teológica que está en la actualidad bajo diferentes perspectivas y con los mejores expertos. El tema de este año será dedicado a la teología sinodal y para abordarlo, hoy estamos muy contentos de recibir a nuestro primer invitado del año, el profesor John Caputo, profesor emérito de la Universidad Villanova, Estados Unidos, que será entrevistado en inglés por el profesor Guillermo Calderón, académico de la Facultad Eclesiástica de Teología de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Valparaíso. Presento brevemente al profesor John Caputo. John Caputo es sin duda uno de los teólogos más destacados de las últimas décadas. El profesor Caputo es conocido por su enfoque radical y original en el campo de la teología, que ha desafiado y enriquecido nuestras comprensiones convencionales de la fe y la espiritualidad. Sus escritos y conferencias han abierto nuevos horizontes en la exploración de la relación entre la teología, la filosofía y la cultura contemporánea. Con una prolífica carrera académica que comenzó en 1968, profesor Caputo ha ocupado numerosos cargos académicos de prestigio, incluyendo la cátedra de Teología, Religión y Filosofía de Villanova University. Es actualmente profesor emérito de esta misma universidad, como también de la Syracuse University. Es autor de numerosos libros que han impactado profundamente en el ámbito teológico-filosófico, entre ellos la debilidad de Dios, la insistencia de Dios y la locura de Dios. Una de las contribuciones más significativas del profesor Caputo a la teología contemporánea es sin duda su desarrollo de la noción de teología débil, una perspectiva que busca redefinir la fe en términos de apertura, interrogación y compromiso con la justicia social y la ética. A través de su enfoque innovador, el profesor Caputo nos desafía a repensar nuestras concepciones tradicionales de lo divino, de lo humano y de lo sagrado, invitándonos a abrazar la incertidumbre y la ambigüedad como partes esenciales de nuestra búsqueda espiritual y existencial. Sin más preámbulo, doy ahora la palabra al profesor Guillermo Calderón para dar inicio a este encuentro que seguramente nos inspirará y nos desafiará en igual medida. Guillermo.
Guillermo, estás en silencio, tu micrófono.
We have what to believe here. Welcome, Jack. Thank you for to be with us. Well, the first question is for you is considering your personal experience, what was the main reason for developing your current theological proposal? How you arrived to this theology?
Well, it was, I think, autobiographical. I mean, I think that I grew up in the 1940s and the 1950s in pre-Vatican II Catholicism. And I was very deeply immersed in that world. And when I graduated from high school, I entered a Catholic religious order, the Brothers of the Christian Schools. I don't know if they have any presence in Chile or not. The De La Salle brothers, they were founded by Jean-Baptiste de La Salle, and we call them the De La Salle brothers or the De La Salle Christian brothers. And it was there in those formative years that I discovered philosophy, because I was interested in theology, and I knew that in order to understand theology, I needed to understand philosophy, and that's how it works in the Catholic tradition. So I discovered philosophy in a religious setting, in a vocational setting, and that really stayed with me. I never, even in when I decided I wanted to do philosophy and be a philosopher and set theology aside and set religion aside, didn't work. It kept coming back on me. And I found that the questions that interested me in philosophy were converging and overlapping with theological questions. And so my work became more and more and more caught up in what um, some people call continental philosophy of religion. So European continental philosophy of religion. And the most famous representative of that would be Jean-Luc Marion. But there was a whole host of people who were interested in thinking about religion and theology from this continental perspective. And I had a particular interest in Jacques Derrida. And so in a curious way, what really got me into writing in a more theological voice was Jacques Derrida, who describes himself as an atheist. And I began to see parallels between deconstruction and the more radical spirit of the New Testament and the notion of the kingdom of God and Derrida's notion of the messianic. And I just got drawn back into your origins are your future, and I was drawn back to what I would call a kind of repetition of my beginnings, because what I ended up saying was very unorthodox. But it was a way for me to understand what had always been important to me from the time I was a child. Um, and you'll see, yeah, you had the book What to Believe in your hand. The first line in that book is, "I cannot remember anything older than God," and that's true. That's true. So the answer to that question is autobiographical.
God with the Gothic letters in the start of your book. Uh, well, do you hear me well? Yeah.
I have a little bit of trouble, but yes, I can hear you.
Well, my second question is when you refer to God's weakness, what concept of weakness do you wish to emphasize?
Yeah, that's very important, and I need to be clear about that, because I'm not encouraging uh, weakness in the ordinary sense. I'm not encouraging uh, being afraid of life and with staying out of things. What I think I mean, the best way to summarize it is to say, I mean it in three different senses. First of all, in an epistemological or dis, discursive sense, I mean to weaken the discourse of theology in to weaken the logos in theology to a poetics. So I'm trying to rewrite or redescribe theology as theopoetics, because I think the concepts in theology are weak concepts. They don't have a bite or a grasp of reality the way a scientific concept would. They're quite different. I think theological discourse, Tom Aquinas says, is analogical. I would say even more strongly, it's metaphoric. We're speaking in symbols and in imaginative constructions, but these imaginative constructions are very important. The kingdom of God is an imaginative construction, but it's profoundly important. Tillich says, when if, to understand the symbol, you don't understand what a symbol is if you say it's only a symbol. So this kind of discourse is deeply important, but it's not conceptual in a strong sense. It's weak conceptual or theopoetic. So there's an epistemological or discursive sense of weakness I have in mind, first of all. Secondly, I have in mind a theological or ontological sense of weakness where I don't think, and this is where I'm, I'm a couple years, I'm a heretic. I don't think there is a big being, an omnipotent entity called God somewhere. So I want to weaken the ontological notion of God from an omnipotent being to what I redescribe as a call, a, uh, uh, a command, a claim that that overtakes us. So it's not subjective. It's something that has me before I have it. Uh, to which I think our lives must be a response. Now that's why I say I want that response to be strong. I don't want the response to be weak. But the weakness is the weakness of a summons, of a call, of a I don't know quite what force, weak force. I can walk away from it. I can ignore it. It's like the call of conscience. I can just ignore it if I want. It's not like the police. It's not a military power. It's it's a weak force which calls me, which addresses me. And then I would say finally, thirdly, there's an axiological sense to weakness, because I think, and now I'm thinking specifically of 1 Corinthians chapter 1,
Mhm.
where Paul turns the world upside down, right? He says the powers of this world think in terms of power and wisdom, whereas if you are in Christ, you think the weakness of God is greater than the power of the world. The foolishness of God is greater than the wisdom of this world. And tamayanta, the nothings and nobodies, are the ones who have real being. So, and there, so the sense of weakness there is the kingdom of God as a kingdom of mercy and forgiveness and love and nonviolence. All the things that Nietzsche hated. Nietzsche was right about Christianity. He just hated it. He said it was a slave revolution in morality, and that's a sort of dismissive way to put what is true. It was a revolutionary, emancipatory consolidation and solidarity of God with the oppressed. It seems to me, a nonviolent one. It met our enemies with love and our trespassers with forgiveness, which was madness to the Romans, right? It's just crazy to the ancient world. I also mean that. I mean weakness, that there is what Nietzsche would call slave morality, and I would say it's a morality of the oppressed. So it's axiological, it's ontological, and it's epistemological. So it's 3 levels of weakness. You're muted, Guillaume. You've muted yourself.
Now, I well,
Okay.
excuse me. Well, then, what is radical theology?
Okay.
What is your definition?
Uh, well, the best way to think about it is to differentiate it from um, confessional theology or denominational theology, or the sort of theology you get if you go to a seminary and you learn Christian theology or Islamic theology, or uh, a theology identifiable with a historical tradition. Now, I'm not against that, right? I'm not trying to explode that. That's because if you do that, then you've got nothing. But what I'm trying to do is radicalize it. So a radical theology is always the radicalization of something. And so in a certain sense, a radical theology would always be parasitical upon the tradition of which it is the radicalization. And there would be as many varieties of radical theology as there are traditions to radicalize. Um, and my work, because of what Heidegger calls our facticity, our Befindlichkeit, the situation in which we find ourselves, is Christian. And so my work is indelibly, irrevocably inscribed within the Christian tradition. And I'm looking for a radicalization of that, which I carry out. And this is why Derrida became very important to me. I carry out in terms of what Derrida calls the event. That is, at one and the same time, the memory that our words of elemental importance, like justice, say, or hospitality, the memory that those words bear with them, but also the promise that they are promises. They're inherited promises, right? So they reach back into a past which precedes us and into a future which we cannot see coming. And but the emphasis is on the future, because the past is, we can't do anything about the past. That's part of the weakness of what Walter Benjamin calls a weak messianic. Right? You know, you can't fix the past. You can reinterpret it, you can remember it, but you can't change it. And so his Messiah is a weak Messiah. But what's possible is the future. And so the event is the coming. It's got a messianic structure. It's the coming, the promise, the to come of what we ultimately cannot see coming. And it's got I think is beautifully, powerfully summarized in the scriptures and in Jacques Derrida in virtually the same language as the possibility of the impossible. With God, all things are impossible. Now, by that he doesn't mean a square circle or 2 and 2 is 5. He means a phenomenological impossibility. That is to say, something that shatters our horizon of expectation. So the justice is a memory, an inheritance, and it is also a promise, because it's always coming. It's never here. It's always what we love and desire, with a desire beyond desire, and with a knowledge that exceeds comprehension. Now, I think that's what's going on in religion, in what we call religion, in Christian Latin, written religion, and Christianity, and it's independent of any theses or theologies or canonical assertions or propositions that we might formulate. I think all of those things, radical theology relativizes that canonical discourse, that propositional discourse, the theses and positions, up to and including the positions like theism and atheism, because I think the event runs deeper than that. Now, all that being said, as I said at the beginning, I am not trying to blow up traditional theologies, because I think you can find these streaks and veins of radical theology in the tradition, in the mystics, in the great thinkers. It's there. It's in the Deus absconditus, in the Gottheit of Gottheit, in Meister Eckhart, in Saint John of the Cross, talking about the dark night of the soul. I think this more profound stream runs through traditional theology, and that's what I mean by the radicalization of traditional theology. It gets down to that. There's this Mother Teresa's memoir, she talks about at one point thinking she was an atheist. She doesn't believe in God anymore. Well, that's good. That means she's she's thinking in a deep way. So the radicalization is a kind of what Heidegger would call a Wiederholung, a retrieval of something that tends to sediment under institutional, and when it's brought into an institution and institutionalized and canonized and thematized.
Well, radical theology, we have front to the radical theology, we have the strong theology, the traditional theology. Considering in Latin America, religious context, in the context of our continent, is very conditioned by the traditional theology. How can radical theology be explained to the people? We have, for example, here the popular religiosity, the devotion to Mary, is a traditional. It's a traditional way to express the religion. How to speak about the radical theology in this context?
Well, I guess I have two answers to that. One is I don't think that there's much to be gained by disturbing the faith of people who, how can I put this, are not intellectuals, who are not doing what we do, who don't make a career out of thinking reflectively and critically about these things. I learned that with my mother. Talking about the Virgin Mary, I one time commented. I wasn't trying to be a smart aleck. I just simply commented, but I've forgotten the occasion, that the Rosary was a devotion that had been instituted in the Middle Ages, and she nearly passed out. She thought the Virgin Mary is the one who came up with the Rosary, and it was passed down by her, for 22,000 years, and she was absolutely shocked by that. And then I thought, okay, my mother was uneducated. She did not go to, she didn't even go to high school, let alone college. So then I thought, okay, that's it. That's the last time I say anything like that. I am not going to disturb her faith, right? But I think as people grow up, when I was a child, I did the things of a child, but when you grow up, we need to be able to answer questions about what this is all about, and where the devotion to the Virgin Mary came from, and why it's not, Protestants don't have the same devotion, and we need to be able to answer those questions. But I think the payoff, the punch, the real bite of what I'm saying has real relevance for the lives of concrete people, because it's really about. I think it is a form of liberation theology. It is, you might say, a postmodern liberation theology, because it says that what's going on in the New Testament is the solidarity of God with the suffering and the oppressed, right? Now, if you and it's asking us to do something about it. It's not saying wait for God to come and fix this thing. It's asking us to do something about it. So I think it has real relevance. And if I were a priest and I had to give a homily, I would, unless I was in a very sophisticated parish, I would not say very much at all about radical theology. I would dwell on this kind of concrete significance, relevance it has for life. But it doesn't need, you don't need strong theology for this. This is a postmodern version of liberation theology. And you may know the work of Nita de Oliveira in Brazil. Do you know Nita? He was a student of mine. he's a very good example of a postmodern version of liberation theology, right? Without the strong, strong Marxist theory is dialectical determinism, right? So it's even Marxists don't want that.
And in, you have mentioned Paul Tillich in your work. What are the points of convergence between you and Tillich, and the difference?
Yeah, he describes himself actually as a border figure, a transitional figure, and a figure of the borders. And he was for me too. I read Tillich many years ago when I was young, and I was still pretty Catholic, and I was starting to come out of that. I was starting to loosen the bonds of dogmatic Catholicism, and Vatican II was in the air, and things were changing. And Tillich was still alive in those days, and he was an elder statesman of um, theology in not only in the United States, but I think he was a cosmopolitan figure. He was a German, of course, and he was well known in Europe, and was uh, he had an eminence, a cultural eminence, and visibility that the theologians don't have anymore. They but he did. So I read him when I was young, and I was in love with him. I thought that was great stuff. And then I don't know. I mean, like a lot of other people, I sort of forgot about him. I went on to work in philosophy, and I was trying not to. For a while there, I was just trying not to think about theology, and he sort of disappeared after he died. He died in 1965. In the 70s and 80s, you had all this postmodernism and poststructuralism, and I think they thought of Tillich was still doing metaphysics, and they wanted to overcome metaphysics. But then, back when you had this sort of theological turn, people went back and rediscovered him, and including me. And it turns out what was important about him uh, for me is, first of all, what he was saying about religion. When he said, look, religion is not a cultural region. It's not a specific element or region in the culture. It's the depths of the culture, so that it can be found anywhere in the culture. So there is a theological depth if you think deeply and ask deep questions in anything, in art, in science, in politics, and not just in religion. And as a matter of fact, religion often is where you're not going to find that depth dimension, because religion does so much damage to itself. So you take a figure like Kafka, say, right? Well, for Tillich, that's theology. That's a man's raising questions about the depths of the mystery of being human, the mystery of being. I'm guilty, but I don't know what I did wrong. And to, asking questions and meditating upon the depths of human experience. So he said, religion is not a matter of holding on to certain beliefs and certain propositions that you accept when you don't have enough evidence, but you accept them on the authority of God. That's a trivialization of faith. Faith is the deepest orientation of our being towards the matters that matter most. Now, you can't beat that. That is what we mean by religion, I think. I never heard a better definition of religion than that. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with cassocks and candles and surplices and churches, right? So that was a game changer for me when I read that. And the other thing that went hand in hand with that for me was what he said about God. When he said, look, God is not the big guy in the sky. God is not the big being. God is not an omniscient, super intelligent, super powerful entity, and you better not get on his bad side because he's coming to get you if you misbehave. He says that is a mythological and idolatrous way to think about God. God is that in which we live and move and have our being. He's the ground of being. And I think that is true. So that's why he's so important to me. But I don't end up with Tillich because I do think that Tillich is talking about metaphysics, a metaphysical being.
Mhm.
Whereas I am more of a, let's say, phenomenologist. And I think I would, so I accept the move from the supreme being to the ground of being, but then I want to make a second move from the ground of being to the call of being, to the being as call, being as summons, being as claim. So from the ontological to the theological. But he's my bridge. He's the transition. If I had to explain it genealogically, that would be the transition.
Tillich spoke about the unconditional, about the unconditionality. Uh, from your point of view, how we can link the name of God as an event core that insists with the unconditionality?
Well, because I think that the only way the call can be a genuine call is if it is unconditional, and that means that it, as the medieval mystics said, Marguerite Perret and Meister Eckhart, that it is without why, sans pourquoi, warum, without why. So they had this paradox, that you should love God. Meister Eckhart said you should love God. Some people love God the way they love their cow for its milk. Right? So they love God out of a fear of hell and a desire to go to heaven. And Meister Eckhart thought that was, he didn't think that was bad. He thought that was imperfect. And that the purity of love would detach itself from that economy, what Jacques Derrida calls an economy, the economy of threat and punishment, or reward and punishment. Like my favorite example of that is the Matthew 25, where you have this exquisite portrait of the servants who feed the hungry and clothe the naked and don't know that it is the master. And so when the master says he's going to reward them, they say, "What? Why? What did we do?" And he says, "Whenever you did that," they say, "Well, we didn't know that was you." And not only did they not know it was the master, they didn't care. That wasn't important. Why did they feed the hungry? Because the hungry were hungry, not because it was the master and they were going to get a reward. So when so that's a good example, I think, of unconditional love, unconditional mercy, forgiveness, justice. I'm not doing it for me. So I think that the only way the call of love or justice can be unconditional is if you remove the conditions. That is, you take it out of this economy of reward and punishment, which I think is mythological, and love for the sake of love is without why. So,
Yes.
Meister Eckhart said, if the love of God demanded that I go to hell for all eternity, then I would rather go to hell for all eternity because that is what God's love desires. So I think the only way for love to be unconditional is if it's for the call, for the kingdom of God to be unconditional, is if it's without, if you extricate it from this economy.
Jack, in your opinion, what place does hope to have today in this uh, hairless Monday, hairless Monday? The hope, what's the place?
Since it all seems kind of hopeless right now, especially if you live in a country that looks like it wants to re-elect Donald Trump as the next president. If that happens, I'm going to see if I can get back into Christian Brothers and lead a monastic life somewhere and just escape. Well, the answer is, as a philosopher, as a philosophical theologian, whatever it is I am, is, we Catholics make a distinction between the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues, right? Between faith, between prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, and faith, hope, and charity. And we say faith, hope, and charity are supernatural virtues, and prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance are natural virtues, which the Greek philosophers had already identified. And I say, well, I think that's something like that's actually true, because I think that the philosophical virtues, four cardinal virtues, are virtues that make sense. They're they're the sort of thing philosophers come up with. They're reasonable. There are good arguments to be made for them, and they're 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 sensible. They're entirely reasonable. The theological virtues are different. There's an excess there that doesn't make sense, right? That is, they're a little bit, I don't want to say crazy, but there's something, they're not, it's not just reason. When you have faith, you can't, you can't, you can't give a good argument for it, right? And insofar as you can give a good argument for it, it's less and less faith and more just pretty reasonable thing to believe. So faith. So now you go back to this thing in Derrida about the logic of the impossible. Faith is faith when it's more and more incredible. The more credible it is, the less faith you need. So there's an element of the faith is faith in the possibility of the impossible. And the most characteristic teaching of all of Jesus was, and the most startling and revolutionary, was this notion of loving your enemies. Because it makes sense to love your friends and your family, but to love your enemies? And he says, well, anybody can love their friends, but to love your enemies, that's the foolishness of God, right? So again, love is love when it's impossible, when it's subject to this condition of the impossible. And finally, so you can see where I'm going with this, and the same thing is certainly true of hope. Insofar as hope is a reasonable expectation, well, that's then you might as well be a stockbroker. You put it's a good bet. This stock is a good bet. So I have hope for this stock making me money in the future. That's not hope. That's just a good bet. hope is hope, just in proportion to the intensity of hope is just in proportion to the hopelessness of the situation. So again, it's the logic of the impossible. And so I like to speak in terms of a hope against hope. In the same way that there's a love of our enemies, I think we have a hope against hope. And so, and that I think is inscribed in our very being, in our bones, that hope. I mean, because I think it has to do with the structure of time. I think we are deeply temporal beings turned toward the future, and keeping the future open, even though that's a risk, right? Because the worst things can happen. The fact that the coming of what you can't see coming could be a disaster. But that goes along with the risk of staying open to the future. So, in a certain way, I think in deconstruction and postmodern theory, in the way that I look at things, hope is a very elemental virtue. It's a fundamental. It's a kind of philosophy of hope. It's a philosophy that says keep the present pliable, plastic, revisable. Don't don't let it sediment. Don't let it congeal. Keep it in a state of what I like to call it optimal disequilibrium, a state of unbalance. Not too much because you'll just fall over, but a kind of optimal disequilibrium which keeps the future open, because that's the structure of hope. Hope is this openness towards the coming of what we can't see coming, knowing that that's a risk. But everything important is a risk. When you say to someone, when you get married and you say, I love you, and you say, oh, you're signing on, for the coming of what you can't see coming. Um, so I think hope is in many, many ways, if you, in what I call a theology of the event, hope is primal. It's a primary character. And it is what it is. It reaches its intensity when you're faced with a hopeless situation. So the Ukrainian people right now is a very good example of it, right? Impossible odds, no chance of winning this thing when it started, and now the Americans, the right wing in the United States wants to pull the plug on support. They still won't quit. They won't give up. There's nothing that will make them give up. So there's a kind of ineradicable hope no matter how hopeless from the point of view of reason, no matter how hopeless it seems, nothing can extinguish that hope. And I think that's what hope is, and so I think it belongs together with this theology of or philosophy or phenomenology of the event, whatever you want to call it. I actually don't think there is a in-kind distinction between philosophy and theology. I think the only way you can make that distinction is to mystify theology and to make it appear to be something that drops from the sky. But I don't. I think theologians are people who are feeling their way among the unknown, trying to make sense of a mysterious world, and they're doing it with imaginative, symbolic forms of discourse, but they don't have any. The skies didn't open up and reveal something to them. So I don't think there's any difference in philosophy and theology. The only difference is the books they read and the conferences they go to.
Thank you so much for to be with us.
Well, I will thank you for your interest in what I'm doing. It's wonderful to know that in Chile people are reading my books, and it makes me I feel very rewarded by that.
Muchas gracias, profesor Caputo, por su tiempo, por su generosidad también. Realmente estamos muy, muy honrados por haberlo escuchado esta tarde en este encuentro. Un encuentro muy, muy interesante, muy estimulante. Así que muchas gracias nuevamente. Muchas gracias también, Guillermo, por haber facilitado y organizado esta entrevista. Antes de terminar, les informo que la próxima sesión de los Diálogos Porteños 2024 está programada el lunes 8 de julio, de las 19 a las 20 horas. Y en esta ocasión tendremos el gusto de recibir a la profesora Carolina Montero, académica de la Universidad Católica Silva Enríquez. Así que muchas gracias por su atención y muy buenas noches.
Ya.